When I say our answer, I am invoking the chain of questions and answers which ramifies from the first question, which is, if there is, then what must be? When I say our answer, I am referring to everything which our existence, which humanity's existence implies, everything which ramifies from us. When I say our answer, I mean our purpose. In order to do this, I am going to examine the section of this chain of questions and answers which precedes us, the questions and answers which act as our analog definition. Because I believe when people wonder over what our purpose is, I believe what they are really seeking is what our nature is. And once you know the nature of something, once you really understand it, once you contain all of the mechanisms which comprise the nature, the purpose reveals itself. In order to demonstrate this mechanism, let us meditate for a moment on cups. Let us fall through their definition and see what there is to see. So a cup is an item, it is a noun, it is not a proper noun, it exists in space. It is a finite object, which means its perimeter must needs eventually wrap back in on itself. It is liquid proof, it is of a certain size and of a certain construction. On their construction, it is oriented to a horizon. And because it is finite, it needs one zero-dimensional shape, that is to say one point, or at least one point, which passes through horizontal. It needs one-dimensional shape, that is to say one line, or at least one line which passes through vertical. And at the top, again, one more line which passes through horizontal. A line and not a point at the top, this so the cup may be drained and filled. On its size, an ampule, at least after being broken open, could be said to be of the same construction and likewise oriented to a horizon, yet an ampule could not be called a cup as it is too small. Its relative size implies a concentration of space. You would never drink a cupful of a substance which belonged in an ampule. On the other side, a tank or a drum would likewise also not be able to be called a cup because they are too large. The greater relative capacity of tanks and drums invoke within their definitions greater relative time. The time aspect is dilated out, moving on to being liquid proof. Well, being liquid proof in a universal sense, but to bring it home to our narrative, I will say waterproof. Being waterproof is not a common quality in the inanimate world. Water is a frenetic substance. It is a difficult thing to contain. But moving into the animate world, the quality of being waterproof becomes much more common. That being said, the force creating the waterproof quality does not belong to the organisms which bear it. They have inherited their waterproofness and can no more alter or improve this facet of them than they can write a short story. The only avenue for them to improve their capital T, their waterproofness, is to procreate and cast their offspring out into the wilderness, capital W wilderness, for them to test their mettle against reality, capital R reality. But again, that is not them making the decision to, that is the force which has brought them all the way to this point acting upon them. It is not a conscious decision for them to assist, to aid and abet that force. A cup, however, is a part of the animate or inanimate world which has been harvested and then modified or fashioned into the construction of a cup, and in the minds of its makers and users oriented to a horizon. So, for example, within a relatively short span of time, a cup could step outside of its definition if a Viking were using a horn goblet and decided to eviscerate his offender. The orientation would then change from horizon to some acute angle to his offender's frame. Thus, we can see cups may be improved or altered at a moment's notice within intragenerationally, without needing to wait for the mechanisms of evolution to exert themselves. Alternately, a cup made from the inanimate world, not harvested from the animate world and modified, borrowing the animate world's waterproof qualities, a hollowed out horn, one can see even more clearly the intentionality required to power the manifestation of a cup. It takes a lot more knowledge and thought to turn clay into a cup than it does to turn a horn into a cup. To wisely make and gently shape and then fire with the force of human's command of fire, capital HCOF. As the nature of cup becomes clearer, as we understand, as we contain that cup is where and when water animals and handles meet, for when one wishes to take from the river the jumpy electric substance to one's table to be enjoyed with what robust vital solubles one can find, reclining in some way to prevent spillage, like drinking collectively the refined primordial soup. The purpose of cup follows. Indeed, I'm sure you can see that when you invoke really any concept via any word, you can see the short path between understanding the nature of that word and the nature and therefore the purpose of all of existence. Really, whenever intelligent life speaks, it is intoning in one unbroken note everything. You can hear the first question, if there is, then what must be? Within the cup conversation, to say nothing of the implications of organisms and intelligent thought, merely the fact that a cup is a finite object in space oriented to a horizon implies much. The quality of being finite and the similarity, especially if the cup is made from the clay, the similarity of the cup to the mountain, to the place in which we are conducting this exercise, becomes evident. If you were to take the individual atoms, the bodies, the motes, the calcium atoms, the carbonate molecules, which comprise the cup, and sequester and tally them, you would see that the cup diminishes, because due to their coordinates in time and space, they are all proper nouns. Likewise, with the mountain, you could take all of the individual bodies of the mountain, sequester and account for them, and you would see the mountain diminish. Thus we know this place which is creating this horizon, or rather at least ceaselessly evidencing it, must also needs be finite, must needs wrap back in on itself, and is formed beneath soft, self-leveling gas, the back of which we can assume to be smooth. Then things like the sphere is implied, which then implies the circle, which then implies the point, and much more. So returning to the main thread of this video, to the main purpose, let us repeat the exercise with humans. My understanding of the nature and purpose of humanity arose from a cup of tea and an excellent, straight out of the 90s educational placemat on our solar system. Now, it depicted the solar system, and at first I thought the flatness of the solar system was only an artistic license taken in order to present the information. After learning that the solar system was indeed shaped that way, in my oniric, detached, childlike consciousness, I imagined into existence some physical entity orienting it either above or below, orienting it into a disk, much the same way that our planet orients the surface of water to two-dimensional shapes. This, of course, is incorrect. The truth of the matter is it had actually fallen into place flat. The clarity, the answer, came in cups of tea. So at the beginning of my relationship with my love for tea, I would drink my cups of tea in stable, quiet settings, either at the kitchen table. Specifically, I began when listening to mystery shows on the radio, and so it was a very sedate setting. Later, I would start drinking them at my desk in my bedroom, but always a very quiet, stable setting. And of course, I was careful with my unwieldy child hands handling these cups of hot liquid, carefully setting them down and picking them up again. And I noticed a strange phenomenon occurring in the bottom of the teacup. The dregs which had fallen from the sachet always organized themselves into a ring in the bottom inside corner of the cup. No matter the direction or force or placement of the initial pour, whether it was a soft pour directly at the center, whether the stream of water curved around the sides of the cup, or whether it was haphazard or biased to one side, the dregs always formed the same even ring around the inside bottom of the cup. So there are several mechanisms forming this ring. The inside perimeter of the cup is catching the otherwise infinite paths outward of these dregs. It is catching and forming the shadow of a full three-dimensional space. The shadow of this full three-dimensional space of these dregs shooting in all different directions is then collapsed in the tension between gravity and the bottom of the cup. The evenness of the ring, despite varying beginning vectors of that initial pour, is the buoyant water suspending time just enough to allow the dregs to meditate upon each other, such that they can eventually come to the most stable arrangement, the most stable shape, which would finally be that even ring. Now, the revelation which illuminated the nature of the phenomenon of a flat solar system came when I brought my cups of tea out and onto the mountain. So I grew up in a forest on a mountain and started bringing my cups of tea out and romping up and down the mountain. And looking down to examine its contents, I saw the ring had collapsed to a point at the center of the cup of tea. Now, the phenomenon occurs whether you are romping literally up and down a mountain or just taking a stroll along the sidewalk, but it certainly helped to illuminate the mechanism of the inside of the cup jostling the dregs into the only logical place they could go besides at the outer wall, which was an infinitely exact representation of the point at the center of the cup. The inside of the cup and its translation of my movement had acted as an analog of gravity. The bottom of the cup had acted as an analog of a horizon. The water in the cup had acted as an analog of thought, of meditation, and the leafy nebula had fallen through the first dimension, the last dimension to retain any relationship with infinity, and had arrived at proper nouns at the zero dimension, had formed a shadow of space, of the concept of space. This mechanism has a name. It is the phenomenon of accretion, and it is how things fall together. That is, how things fall together if there are present weak forces of gravity, which in this case, as I mentioned, had the analog of the three-dimensional motion pushing in from all sides. And this is where, if you understand the components comprising a nature, if you contain them, their shapes and mechanisms, they will sometimes act of their own accord and extrapolate themselves out for you. Immediately, the mechanism extrapolated upwards and downwards, forwards and backwards, and I understood this is how things fall together given any forces interacting between the components of the cloud. They shed dimensions. So if there are any weak forces of gravity pulling the motes of a cloud or of any shape together, then the process of accretion may occur. So I saw the nebula, the three-dimensional nebula, no matter in which shape it had started, as it collapsed, as it fell into itself, it made sense that it would have fallen as a disk. And then immediately thereafter, the disk, as the disk falls into itself, it only makes sense that that two-dimensional shape would then fall down, form around, would represent, would imply, would refer to, would gather around zero-dimensional shapes, the planetesimals and planetoids and asteroids and comets and moons and stars. This cohesive singular motion, this unbroken vector, allows us to catch a glimpse of the nature of the universe. It allows us to glimpse its intention. It allows us to view a few curves of the countenance of all, of capital A, all. As the motion through space falls down to its physical limits of quietude, the background in these meditations goes from being the blackness of the void to rusty oranges and browns. Now coming down and landing upon the surface of these now planets in our narrative, a planet which contains the three basic forms of matter, which is to say solid, liquid, and gas. Yes, plasma, but for our purposes, solid, liquid, and gas. Now, it only makes sense that the heaviest, the densest form of matter would form the bones upon which the other two would rest. The second densest would fall on top of the most dense, and the least dense, the gas, would then float on top of both of them. Thus, lakes and rivers and puddles would be an expected universal phenomenon for any planet with all three forms of matter present. This also explains something that confused me for a very long time, something about rivers. I'm sure you've heard what people, I think, wrongly call a factoid of rivers, the curves of rivers somehow equaling pi, somehow having a relationship to the circle, capital C, the circle. I'm not a mathematician, but it makes sense because the rivers and lakes and oceans form with the planet. It's all one cohesive movement. So it makes sense that there would be a shadow of the circle, shadow of the nebula. A shadow of the circle would be carved into how the liquid falls and sculpts the solid portion of the planet. So spending time in these slimy, fatty, salty, electric puddles of freshly fallen planets, pre-organic planets, experiencing, at least on this leg of their journey, for the first time, a titanic quietude, would finally have the chance to meditate on each other, to submit configurations, to submit hypotheses to reality, capital R, and take the results as gospel, would be forced to take the results as gospel. Now, solids do, of course, meditate upon each other, but to no particular end. Things like vermiculate structures and crystals and volcanic structures do form, but there is no end to them. They have no purpose. Likewise, on the other side, gases do meditate upon each other, but it would be more similar to a subconscious rather than consciousness. The interactions of gases are fleeting, are ephemeral, but the buoyancy that water has, of which I make much mention, allows all things which water has the ability to trap and hold to think on each other. Thus, given even a remotely comprehensive sample of the 100 and change elements found in existence will form spontaneously things like ions, things like carbonate, things like fats. Some of these fats will form such that they have a polar region and a nonpolar region, a hydrophilic region and a hydrophobic region. Now, given these things forming spontaneously, they will be drawn together because now we're talking, instead of, as we have been, instead of the weak attractive forces in between bodies, now not only are they falling, but they are being drawn by the strong attractive forces into shapes. Like a fisherman gently gathering time and space as he floats his line in the river must switch mechanics once he feels it go taut. And the shape that these spontaneously formed fats makes is a sphere. So, following this momentum that has led us to these puddles, the universe's momentum will not falter. It must find a way to push through the bounds of physical quietude and continue meditating upon itself. And it is things like these fat spheres in which it will find a path forward, thus creates space on the inside, indeed creates the first inside, which it then seeks to regulate. It is the first bit of information, the first record, the first memory, which seeks to self-perpetuate. It is contesting the environment of the puddle and the Turanian environment abroad and the wild gases beyond that and the magnetic force field beyond in order to maintain its shape, because I believe if too many ions enter the sphere, the shape will destabilize and lies. Think of a swoosh or a ripple in a nebula, the size of it, the amount of information it contains per cubic unit, and its propensity to scatter against other forces, its willingness to relinquish its relation to the initial force which created it. In comparison, this is a very concentrated amount of information that is now self-perpetuating. So on two fronts, it is in the metaphysical world of the collapsing universe. Now, of course, the fall inward progresses, again, because the momentum of the universe will not falter. And the spheres develop new mechanisms, new techniques to increase its durability. The ones that happen to incorporate the new mechanisms succeed, live on, and the ones which do not eventually lies, until eventually there are full organisms which are doing the exact same thing, perpetuating that force which has been in effect since the nebula, perpetuating the concentration of information, always at the highest resolution and density it has yet been. Now, after the fall has entered the animate world, there are successive matriculations of format of information which represent the universe falling into negative dimensions of greater magnitude. So the second dimension would come about with the advent of language. Even if the animals who eventually pioneered language had abstract thought before then, the abstract thought was not truly incorporated into the fabric of existence. It was caged within the organisms lucky enough to experience abstract thought before the advent of language, until it was able to take advantage of the many mechanisms to which language grants access. Language is more buoyant in time. It does not follow the law of mortality as closely as do species and their representative organisms which comprise them. Much as the movement of fat through space slows in soup, so too does language give the ability for abstract thought to slow and meditate upon itself in space and time. Information now no longer has to wait for successive generations to evolve. It can evolve very rapidly intra-generationally. Language allows abstract thought to travel great distances. It allows it to traverse great oceans of time. Thus, the universe reaches the next threshold, the next level of compacted information, of dense information. As far as I can cipher, we have only just recently fallen into the third negative dimension, and that would be the advent of the digital world, of the digital meridian. Now, previous to the digital world, although one could immerse oneself in abstract thought, one could, for the easy example, one could become a philosopher and make one's living in philosophy, but still one would have chains which bound them to the real world. Their ideas would still have to work themselves out in the only format available to them in the real physical world in which all humans used to live. Now, with the advent of the digital world, we have created this corrupted space in from which we can pull our limbs in from the wilderness, pull our feet up and pull our hands in, and no longer submit our hypotheses to reality in order to be met with success. Previously, we were compelled to take those results as gospel because the scythe of reality would dispense of failed experiments. This is the cold, blind, unfeeling nature of evolution. Still, though, the digital world is not completely removed. It is still built, as Matrix lovers would know already. It is still built, based and situated in the real physical world. So this corrupted metaspace will gather the pressure of collective failure until eventually its perimeter, its boundary collapses, spilling its viscera outside to reckon with the wilderness. A collapse which I intend to do my fair share to initiate. Now to the point. Now that we have illuminated the connection between the first question and our existence, now that we have situated ourselves in the grand scheme and understand our nature, now that we have asked what really is going on here, our role, our purpose, our answer becomes clear. We are the latest manifestation of existence endeavoring to understand itself. We are meditation. We are the mechanism. We are the metaphysical, universal, inevitable manifestation of all, trying to figure itself out. Our purpose is to discover, not only scientifically, not only how frogs procreate, how species of fish bioluminesce. Our purpose is to go now into the physical and metaphysical, to go forth intrepidly, with determination, into the unknown, and to discover ourselves, to discover what we can become, to discover what we, capital W, we the water, we the nebula, we the one unbroken, cohesive fall inward ought become.